Sensational news. Hungary is being stripped of its voting rights. Shocking moves by the EU. What is Orban hiding and why is Europe no longer willing to tolerate it? Shock. Putin has the Hungarian Prime Minister in a chokehold. No one expected such compromising material. Orban is on the edge. Protests, sanctions, diplomatic pressure. The end is closer than it seems. I'll tell you all the details in just a moment. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Victoria Panchenko, and here are the latest events. Shock. Viktor Orban could lose power as early as next year. In 2026, parliamentary elections will be held in Hungary, and Orban will be hit hard even within his own country, where he is gradually losing popularity. Moreover, the persecution of Orban has already begun. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets in Budapest on September 21st, 2025, protesting against the Prime Minister's policies and the campaign of hatred he has unleashed. The protesters accused Orban of spending taxpayers' money on campaigns aimed at misleading voters and inciting hostility, trying to gain political advantage from it. But that's not all. Orban is under pressure from all sides. It turns out that Putin has compromising material on the Hungarian Prime Minister. What does Moscow know about such a pro-Hungarian leader? What is he so afraid of? What other obstacles is Orban willing to create to keep the world from learning the truth about him? Is it possible to strip Hungary of its veto right in the EU? Explosive details coming up right now.
It seems there is something more between Orban and Putin. Some compromising material on the Hungarian Prime Minister.
Nevertheless, it is important to note that one of these particular countries is indeed Hungary, a nation located in Central Europe.
As a direct and undeniable result, constantly quarreling with Brussels has long since become Viktor Orban's established political style, quite unlike the situation with many other European countries.
We used to have to dance to Moscow's tune. Brussels plays its own tune too, but we dance as we please. And if we don't want to, we don't dance at all.
And blocking Ukraine's path is Hungary's main goal in the European Union. Budapest says no to almost everything, from frozen Russian assets to other forms of aid. And of course, against Ukraine in the EU.
We stopped Ukraine's accession to the European Union. We did this despite strong resistance. We would instantly find ourselves at war with the Russians. That's why Ukraine's membership in the EU must not be allowed, because it would bring war to Europe and Hungary.
As a result of the fact that a single vote from Hungary can block everything during voting, EU countries have proposed changing the decision-making process, specifically moving from unanimity to majority voting.
There needs to be a shift from the absolute method of decision-making to majority voting. And I think that at this point, the European Union is moving in that direction. We understand that the bureaucratic machine within the EU doesn't work as quickly as we would like, but such fundamental reforms often require time, and in addition, political will is needed. It seems there are no problems with the latter, but as always, there isn't enough time.
There was even a time when the EU made a decision without Hungary's consent. This was about the frozen Russian assets. Hungary abstained from voting, but Brussels decided to use the money without its consent.
During Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, we have repeatedly seen various tools that the European Union used to bypass Hungary's veto right. This included political pressure and economic threats.
Nevertheless, a group of members of the European Parliament even called on Brussels to freeze funding for Hungary due to Orban's failure to comply with EU laws and values.
Of course, the European Union's funding instrument in favor of the Hungarian budget is quite a strong argument for changing Orban's position. The Hungarian budget and the implementation of government programs largely depend on the subsidies that Budapest receives from Brussels. That is why this mechanism has been used repeatedly, and I think it will continue to be used in the future until political reform is implemented. And important decisions can be made without significant pressure or taking into account the opinion of Orban himself.
But imagine, up until around 2009, Orban was a staunchly anti-Russian politician. But after that, something suddenly changed in his stance, and he began to play by the Kremlin's rules.
We need to understand that you can't make deals with the Russians. Unless it's to sign some kind of encrypted 10-year agreement from which it won't be clear who they are, what exact economic calculations it's based on, or how it will even affect Hungary's development.
And the reason for all this is supposedly some compromising material that Putin has on Orban, which, as reported, is what changed his rhetoric. Back in 1990, the Prime Minister of Hungary allegedly received a suitcase full of money from a Russian crime boss, and the handover itself was recorded by a hidden camera. But the issue may not even be just about that.
Orban himself is personally dependent on Russian money, and his position is nothing other than a pure and undeniable example of political corruption, clearly in favor of a hostile state.
For Orban himself, personal enrichment is no less important. Through business and connections with Russian oligarchs, he has become the richest person in Hungary, as evidenced by his mansion worth 45 million euros. Since Orban does not serve the interests of the Hungarian people, nor does he consider the interests of Europe or Ukraine, it is reported that he could lose power as early as 2026.
We await the next parliamentary elections in Hungary with cautious optimism because there is a strong possibility that Orban will actually lose them, and a party that is more Eurocentric will come to power. At the same time, it is clear that this party would support Ukraine.
For now, however, Orban remains the gateway through which Putin can influence the European decision-making process. And this, of course, poses a threat both to the peoples of Europe and to Ukraine.
It seems that Europe is baring its teeth and is determined to rein in Hungary. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna has called on Europeans to take a tougher stance toward
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Viktor Orban. According to him, stripping Hungary of its voting rights is possible in order to prevent a split in Europe.
Article 7. The Treaty on European Union provides for the possibility of depriving a member state of its voting rights if its membership threatens the security of Europe and other members. After all, this is exactly what Orban has been doing for a long time.
Lithuania is also hinting at some new mechanisms. We cannot be hostages to Orban in the EU. There are ways to move forward. This statement was made by Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys.
There is one, Plan B. We cannot be hostages to veto Hungary, and there are ways for us to move forward. Even during Denmark's presidency, we have the opportunity and time to move to informal stages of Ukraine's accession to the EU, which will be formally finalized a little later. The current enlargement methodology allows for such an approach. Plan B should be launched already this fall. The momentum is there now. Delaying it is dangerous.
But for now, Orban still manages to balance between Putin and the EU. For the sake of sanctions against Russia, the European Commission is ready to unfreeze 550 million euros for Hungary. Since Brussels is trying to overcome Prime Minister Orban's veto on imposing additional sanctions targeting imports of Russian energy resources, the EU can only adopt new sanctions unanimously. At the same time, Hungary and Slovakia, which remain the last importers of Russian oil in the European Union, have repeatedly threatened to block new initiatives and, in particular, have threatened to veto new measures against Russia. Let us recall that on Friday, September 20th, the European Commission presented a proposal for the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. As reported by the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the new package of sanctions includes a ban on the import of Russian LNG. The bloc's chief of foreign policy, Kaja Kallas, clarified that the deadline for the EU's complete phase-out of Russian LNG has been postponed by 1 year, from the previously planned date of January 1st, 2027. The package includes a complete ban on transactions with the companies Gazprom Neft and Rosneft, as well as sanctions against 118 shadow fleet vessels and 45 Russian and foreign companies.
We are also targeting those who purchase oil in circumvention of the sanctions.
Those who fuel Russia's war. We are targeting oil refineries, traders, and petrochemical companies in third countries, including China. In 3 years, Russia's oil revenues in Europe have dropped by 90%. Now we are finally turning this page for good. Notably, China is not only being targeted by Europe, the White House is preparing a devilish punishment for China for supporting Putin. India has also fallen out of favor with Trump. The new, extremely harsh package of measures could lead to a global turning point. What will this lead to? Find out right now.
The U.S. is urging G7 countries to force India and China to impose higher tariffs on Russian oil imports.
First of all, it's important to understand that when they analyze why the sanctions against Russia did not have the expected effect, there was an effect, but more was expected. It was because the sanctions were imposed by Western countries, while the countries of the global South, primarily India and China, did not impose these sanctions. And then they started thinking about how to get India and China to join in, even if only de jure, but de facto, to join the sanctions against Russia. And they decided that this is actually an element of so-called secondary sanctions, or secondary tariffs, when tariffs are imposed on a country for buying Russian energy resources.
By raising the purchase price of oil, the United States wants to push Moscow to the negotiating table with Ukraine, reports the Financial Times.
It seems to me that this is an idea far from realistic from the very start. Although, of course, the significant weakening of Moscow is also greatly to our benefit, and certainly not to our detriment. But in this regard, there are quite a few problems, a great many, in fact.
Experts note that the United States is using Russia's war in Ukraine as a pretext to impose tariffs against India and China.
This is being done, let's say, from the US perspective, simply because they want to do it. From the EU's point of view, yes, they do need there to be some pressure on Russia. But this is a very important point. Is Russia really the reason, or is it actually that, let's say, the real reason is that the US wants to impose these tariffs against China and India? Because there's some background to this issue. In April of this year, the US raised tariffs on products from many countries, but this caused certain problems within the United States itself. And many people said that you can't do this without a casus belli, meaning without a reason to impose these tariffs, without a pretext for conflict.
Journalists from the New York Times reminded that in August, the US raised tariffs on imports from India to 50% because of India's purchases of Russian oil. In April, US President Donald Trump sharply increased tariffs on imports from China, but in May, he lowered them again after a strong negative reaction from the market.
Will Trump achieve this ahead of a possible meeting with Xi Jinping, which theoretically could take place in South Korea? At the summit, I think, on October 30th, if I'm not mistaken. Possibly later. We know that with Donald Trump, the precise timing of various events can spontaneously shift and change, so it's truly impossible to accurately predict anything for sure at all.
Free trade is a fundamental principle of the European Union's activities. In fact, the introduction of tariffs contradicts the EU's statutory provisions, which support sanctions against the Kremlin.
There is agreement on the need to put pressure on Russia, but the principles differ. So they are searching for this common ground. Whether it will be found, we can only hope. In any case, economic weakening awaits us. Russia is extremely important to us. But the methods of weakening Russia that the West can use are quite very contradictory at the moment currently.
Economic pressure on Russia is what both the EU and Ukraine need, as Ukraine is holding back the enemy while negotiations are ongoing.
The EU, in fact, understands that an existential threat is coming from Russia, and the 23 drones that flew into Poland are the materialization of this threat. Today it's 23 drones, but what will happen in 2 months is unclear. Therefore, naturally, Europe can be persuaded toward the idea of secondary tariffs precisely through the argument of the Russian threat, which is what the US is doing now. If Europe is pressured enough, then China and India might start to wonder whether it's worth buying.
It's difficult to replace Russian goods on the market, but it's entirely possible. For that, first and foremost, there needs to be political will and a desire from Europe.
And what do you think? Will the EU be able to rein in Orban, and by what means? We're looking forward to your comments. There's more to come. Stay tuned for the main news and don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies above.